Good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome to this, which is our latest in our 5 in 25 series of webinars. And today we're going to be focusing on the selection stage, which is always an interesting part of the procurement process that throws up a lot of tricky issues. Quick introductions, just while everybody's continuing to join. I'm Jenny Beresford-Jones, and I'm a professional support lawyer and public procurement specialist here at Mills & Reeve. And I'm pleased to be joined today by my two colleagues, Rona McPherson and Shailee Howard, both of whom are principal associates here and also public procurement specialists. Before we get started on the session today, just a flag to everybody, if you haven't yet noticed, that the new procurement bill has been introduced to Parliament recently. I think it was on the 11th of May, and that's going to be the bill that ultimately will become the new Act of Parliament that regulates public procurement. So just really to draw your attention to that, as you can see from this graphic here on the slide, it's got quite a few stages to go through until it becomes finalised. That's not expected to be until sometime in 2023 at the earliest. But really just to flag to you that it has been published, so it's out there. We're putting together some materials on that. So do look out for those. I think they will come around by email, and you can also always check our procurement portal reform page for all the latest materials that we've produced on procurement law reform, and the link is there on the slide. So just in terms of housekeeping before we get started, this webinar is being recorded and a recording will be sent around afterwards, so you can check back or forward that on to a colleague. But rest assured, nobody can be seen in the recording apart from the panelists. In terms of questions, we're going to try very hard to stick to our 30-minute slot today, so we've not got time for questions in the session itself, but do feel free to put any legal questions for the panel into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and what we will do is take those and put them together into some sort of Q&A document that we will send around a few days after this event. If anyone's having difficulty getting connected or on the technical side of things, again, pop a question in the Q&A. My colleague Sarah, who looks after the tech side, will try and help you to get connected. And finally, hoping that the technology works. I think it usually does. When the webinar ends, you should see a feedback form pop up on your screen. Be really grateful if you could spare a minute or two just to fill that in. It really helps us to make sure that our sessions are relevant and interesting, and it will inform how we present the rest of our 5 in 25 series this year. So I think in terms of housekeeping, that was all I was going to say. And I will hand over to my colleague Rona, who's going to talk to us about this really tricky issue of how you deal with the incumbent advantage at selection stage. So thank you, Rona.
Thanks, Jenny. Good morning, everyone. So first up, dealing with incumbent advantage. For anyone who's new to procurement, this just means how we best manage the advantage that our current provider or supplier will have if it chooses to bid for the new contract. Why do we need to manage this? Firstly, if the incumbent wins, a likely ground for challenge is that the incumbent had a huge advantage and the contracting authority didn't do enough to level up the playing field to ensure equal treatment of bidders. Secondly, we need to ensure bidders aren't put off and we receive lots of good bids and obtain value for money for the public purse. Therefore, we need to convince other bidders that they have a chance of winning and it's not just going to be a shoo-in for the current provider. How do we do this? There's two work streams here. One, what you do with your incumbent, and two, what you do with your potential bidders through pre-market engagement. Getting things arranged with your incumbent supplier is important before you start the pre-market engagement. Talk to your incumbent, tell them why this matters, find out if they're actually going to bid. If they are keen to win again, normally they shouldn't want the new contract to be subject to challenge or declared ineffective. Therefore, it's important they understand that this exercise is in their interest too. Ask your incumbent supplier to provide you with written details of how it intends to manage the potential conflict arising from the two roles that it plays, that is, incumbent supplier and potential bidder. For example, some suppliers, and this is probably more likely with larger entities, have separate bid teams that are nothing to do with the day-to-day operations of your contract. They might offer to ensure the two teams are kept separate. You could ask them then to agree to signature of a non-collusion certificate that differs slightly from the standard ones that other bidders will sign. The incumbent's non-collusion certificate can include statements of the type that there has been no collusion, canvassing, or information sharing between the bid team and the operations team, that the bid team have been working in a different location to the operations team, that there will, until the end of the procurement process, be no movement of personnel between the two teams. All these steps would evidence in the event of a challenge that the contracting authority had taken count of the potential advantage and implemented steps with the aim of ensuring a level playing field, even if the incumbent chooses not to follow what it had signed up to. Should you exclude the incumbent? Probably not. Firstly, the incumbent could claim that this was completely disproportionate and that given the alternatives, as we've just discussed, the contracting authority was breaching its duty of acting proportionately. And secondly, you could be missing out on a really good bid. Suppliers next. Maybe your contract's been in place for so long, it seems the supplier is completely embedded in your organization, or your contract is so complex that no one else could understand it. Therefore, you might be concerned other bidders would be put off. With suppliers, leveling the playing field starts at pre-market engagement. Make sure your potential bidders have as much information as possible about the services that you're procuring. It will be impossible, and the market understands this, for bidders to know as much about the services as the incumbent. It's just not going to happen. But again, if you can show that you provided the information you reasonably considered was required to enable a level playing field, and you'll have recorded your reasoning for this in your Regulation 84 report, it goes without saying, you have another potential shield in the event of a challenge based on unfair advantage. You can run a pre-market event, advertised by means of a PIN, set out your requirements, and with the incumbent's agreement, let bidders know what steps you've taken to manage this advantage. If you're issuing a questionnaire to attendees, you can include with other questions a question asking them what they think the contracting authority could do to ensure a level playing field. This has the benefit that if the contracting authority takes steps in respect of what it learns from bidders, it's then harder for an unsuccessful bidder to raise this point in any challenge. However, you must be careful that any suggestions from potential bidders would not, if implemented, unfairly benefit that particular bidder. Also, as part of any pre-market engagement exercise, make sure potential bidders are aware of any major changes to the contract as was. For example, are there new services to be incorporated, existing services to be dropped? Will the scope and value change significantly? You may be including social value with its 10% weighting for the first time. Knowledge of these types of changes can potentially A, give bidders more confidence that it's worth their while to participate, and B, lessen claims overall of incumbent advantage if the incumbent isn't simply bidding again for the exact same contract. So do think over what can be added to or subtracted from your contract and make sure the market is aware of these changes. Now I'll pass you over to Jenny, who's going to talk about drafting selection criteria. Have I got that wrong?
That's right.
No.
Thank you. Thank you, Rona. Yeah, I'm next up, and I'm talking about selection criteria. So yeah, this is really just a sort of a high level view of the sort of principles that you should keep in mind when you're drafting selection criteria. I think a bit later, Rona's going to come on to some of the more detail about how you might use the CCSSQ. But really what I'm talking about here is the high level principles. So I suppose the first question really is when we're drafting lawful selection criteria, I think there are three places we can look for guidance on how to do so lawfully, and I've set those out on the slide here. So first of all, obviously there's the Public Contracts Regulations 2015. There's also case law, and also there's those general procurement principles that we all know and love: transparency, equal treatment, non-discrimination, and proportionality. So these are the three areas that we need to sort of keep in mind when trying to draft our selection criteria. So I suppose the key message we really wanted to get across is the distinction between selection and award. It's really important that this distinction is made and understood, because to confuse them is actually a breach of the regulations. So the selection stage, which is what we're talking about today, is sort of backward looking. We're looking at what has the bidder done to date, who is the bidder, what are their capabilities. And so the criteria that we're using at selection stage are evaluating the bidder and not the bid. In contrast, though, the award stage is forward-looking. It's looking forward to how will the bidder deliver this particular contract, and it's evaluating the bid, the tender that they submit. How well does this tender meet our requirements for this contract? So it's a really key distinction to keep in mind when you're looking at your selection criteria and at using the CCSSQ, and Rona will come on to talk a little bit more about the detail of using that. So as I've said, it's a breach of the regulations to confuse those two. There is a bit of an exception where you can show that the nature or the identity of the staff involved will really have a significant impact on contract performance. So where you can say that the person delivering the contract will make a big difference to how the actual contract is delivered. So I suppose we're thinking really there about things like consultancy services or legal services. Well, it really matters who the lawyer is, who the consultant is. So you can assess staff experience at award stage in those types of situations, and that's because it goes to the heart of what the bid is offering, and it's not to do with who the bidder is and what their capacities are. So in terms of drafting selection criteria, we look at Regulation 58, and that says we don't have a completely free hand in drafting these. There are three sort of headings under which our criteria may fall. First of all, is this general idea of suitability. Is this bidder a suitable person to pursue professional activity to deliver this contract? And that is assessed, and Rona will come on to talk to us about that, through the mandatory and discretionary exclusion criteria at Regulation 57. So that's the kind of, are they suitable, full stop kind of question. If you get over that hurdle, then obviously we're looking to, we can then assess economic and financial standing and technical and professional ability. We can also look for guidance in Regulation 58, which tells us that the criteria that we use must be linked to the subject matter of the contract, and they must be proportionate to it. So you don't have a completely free hand to draft those criteria however way you might like. And likewise, what's often forgotten, I think, is whatever criteria you come up with for economic and financial standing and technical and professional ability, you must be able to frame them within Regulation 60, which sets out the acceptable means of proof. So it's Regulation 60, subparagraph 6 for economic and financial standing, and Regulation 60, subparagraph 9 for technical and professional ability. And just a final word, I did mention at the start that case law also gives us a steer, and particularly the SIAC and healthcare at home cases, which introduced to us this concept of the R-wind tenderer. Now that stands for the reasonably well-informed and normally diligent tenderer. And what those cases say is that however we draft our selection criteria, we must do so in a way so that they are transparently clear to this notional, objective, reasonably well-informed and normally diligent tenderer. Could an objective tenderer reasonably be expected to understand what we mean by our selection criteria? So that was all I had to say on the sort of high-level principles. And I think Shailee now is going to look at the tricky question of how do you decide how many bidders to take through to tender stage? Thanks,
Thanks,
Shailee.
Jenny. Thanks, Jenny. Morning, everyone. So yes, I'm going to talk about how many bidders can you take through to the tender stage? So how many can you shortlist? So firstly, we need to look at Regulation 65, and that sets out the specific requirements on the reduction in number of bidders to participate in the next stage of the procurement process. So where you have a restricted process, the minimum number is 5 bidders. Where you have a competitive procedure with negotiation, a competitive dialogue, or even an innovative partnership, then the minimum number is 3 bidders. Excuse me. And in every case, the minimum number of bidders to be invited should be enough to ensure genuine competition. And I'll come on to talk a bit about what that means. I'll also talk about what happens where the number that get through is actually below that minimum as well, and whether the authority can continue with the process. So what you've got to do, and what Regulation 65 says you've got to do, is just as Jenny's just said, you have to set out in your contract notice or in your SQ the criteria and the rules that you're going to apply in order to come to that shortlist, and you've got to set out the minimum that you're going to invite, and where applicable, the maximum as well, and sort of what that mechanism is for deciding how many get through. So there is some flexibility to take through additional bidders beyond that minimum. But what's important is that you set out those fair, non-discriminatory and transparent rules to decide that shortlist. Generally speaking, it's not permissible to state a range without that mechanism. So the authority can't wait to see how many bidders it gets and which bidders actually submit a completed SQ before setting that shortlist. So for example, if you have a restricted procedure, you might say that the way we're going to decide how the minimum of 5 get through is we're going to see who meets those pass-fail criteria, and then we'll take the scored questions and we will shortlist the top 5. So that's generally how you would sort of set out how many go through. Another common question we get asked is, what do we do if there's a tie break? So what do we do where either one or two bidders have scored the same, or have scored very closely together? And again, sort of that should be treated in the same way. So the SQ document can set out in advance how the authority is going to determine what it will do in that scenario. So common things that we've seen are stating that bidders who are within X percent, so sort of maybe 3 or 4% of each other, will be taken through. Sometimes authorities pick a question that's sort of the most important to them, so the highest weighted question, and say that the bidder who scores highest in that question will be taken through, although that can be quite complex if the bidders have scored the same on that question, and then you can sort of go down a bit of a rabbit hole. Saying things like we'll invite those tied bidders to a presentation can be quite difficult. That can lack transparency and introduce subjectivity into the process. So we would generally advise against that sort of mechanism. Another thing to consider is, what does your market look like? So as part of your market engagement, have you got a good idea of how many suppliers are out there who can meet your requirements? How strong is your incumbent? And thinking about all those things that Rona's just spoken about. So really using that market intelligence to determine what your shortlist looks like is helpful too. And finally, from me, a quick note on the approach around deselection. So as I've said, you've got to set out in your SQ how you're going to decide your shortlist, so how you will implement your selection criteria to generate your shortlist. As I said earlier, you can proceed with less than the minimum. So if through operation of your selection methodology, actually in a restricted process, you only end up with 4, so only 4 have met your pass-fail thresholds and have answered all the qualitative questions, that might be okay, as long as it's enough to ensure genuine competition. And what that means will depend on the procurement. So, for example, in a competitive dialogue process with a very strong incumbent, then 2 bidders might not be enough at the shortlisting stage. It might lead to the withdrawal of the other bidder, of the non-incumbent bidder, and you might end up in a single bidder scenario, and value for money might be difficult. So in that scenario, I think that might be difficult. On the other hand, in a restricted process where you've got 4, that might be more workable. It might also be a good idea to think about what the rest of your process looks like. So if you've got a competitive dialogue where there's going to be an initial sift before dialogue is entered into, then you might want to have a larger shortlist, which you then reduce further before you launch into dialogue. So plenty to think about in terms of setting that number. I think I will hand over now.
Hello again. Thanks, Shailee, for that. So the next question is, can you depart from the CCS standard selection questionnaire? Sometimes we are asked to review draft selection questionnaires for clients where they've made some changes to questions or sections, or we get asked if they have to use the SQ or can they omit some of the questions. So I'm just going to run through some of the basics here. Generally, you must use the standard selection questionnaire for all above threshold procurements, and doing so actually goes towards ensuring compliance with the public contracts regulations. Regulation 57 of the PCR sets out the mandatory and discretionary exclusion grounds that you must apply. These grounds are set out in parts 1 and 2, so you don't even have to think about the actual regulations. Regulation 58 sets out what you're allowed to include in selection criteria, as Jenny has just run through, and is also reflected in the SSQ in part 3. However, you don't have to stick to the SSQ as is. First of all, parts 1 and 2 cannot be amended, and you probably wouldn't want to anyway, given this is where suppliers provide their company or bidding entity structure information and the information that will help you decide whether or not they should be excluded in accordance with the PCR. As for part 3, SSQ guidance states that there is an expectation that no changes will be made to the questions in part 3. It can, however, be tailored to a certain extent to suit your procurement. Firstly, you don't have to use all the questions, only those that are relevant and proportionate to your procurement. The obvious example is question 8.3, which concerns the use of steel. This won't be relevant for many procurements. Also, if you're dealing with a low risk, low value procurement, you might even choose to lose the questions in relation to economic and financial standing. Certain questions could be amended, but you have to report these changes to the Public Procurement Review Service. However, you have the right to change the wording of questions to suit the e-procurement system that you're using without the requirement to notify. However, you mustn't change the actual content of the question itself. You can also make use of the right to ask project-specific questions. However, these must be exactly that, project-specific, and also relevant to the services being procured. You most likely want to make use of this ability to ask questions about supplier experience. Do watch out, however, that the type of experience you want suppliers to have isn't too narrow, so that you're breaching the procurement principle of treating all bidders equally. The type of question I mean, and we do see this, is asking if they have delivered a certain type of service for a certain type of contracting authority in a certain type of limited geographical area, such as a certain town. If you find yourself wanting to ask this type of question, it's useful to break down each element. For example, what is it about that limited geographical area that would mean a supplier that had delivered services there was better suited than one which had not? What are the issues in that area that a supplier would have to deal with in delivering services? We can change the question so it asks for experience working in areas that also have those issues. As ever, going back to what Jenny said, be wary with project-specific questions that they don't take on the form of award stage questions. That is, questions looking at how the bidder would perform the services. Ones to avoid are questions of the type, what is your approach to delivering? And then you cite a certain aspect of the service. Questions like these might be seen by bidders as an opportunity to describe the first-class way in which they're going to deliver the services you're procuring, rather than how these types of services have been delivered by them in the past. The final point here is make sure it's very clear how you're scoring project-specific questions. Are they pass-fail? Is it clear what needs to be demonstrated to achieve a pass? and what happens if they fail? And if the questions are scored, does your scoring methodology work for all questions? And is there sufficient information in the questions themselves or elsewhere in the procurement pack? And we'd recommend cross-referencing in the question if that's the case, so that a bidder knows what type of experience they need to demonstrate to achieve higher scores. As ever, bidders need to know what good looks like. Thank you. I'll now pass you back to Shailee for our final question.
Thanks, Rona. So we're going to finish off talking about a few PPNs that have been released recently. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the three on the slide. So firstly, there is PPN 621, which is called Taking Account of Carbon Reduction Plans in the Procurement of Major Government Contracts. So this applies to procurements that are advertised on or after 30th of September 2021. It applies to in-scope authorities, which are central government departments, executive agencies and non-department public bodies, but it may also be very useful to other contracting authorities as well, wanting to assess commitment to net zero objectives as part of their procurement process. The intention is in this PPN to include additional selection criteria, and the PPN does set out in the annex some suggested questions and scoring methodologies. And the idea is it's a requirement to provide for bidders to provide a carbon reduction plan and also set out the environmental management measures they have in place, which relate to the net zero commitments. Now, as Rona and Jenny have both mentioned, there's still a requirement to make sure that when you are applying these PPNs, that they are relevant to the subject matter of the contract, and it's proportionate to do so in that case. So you've really got to consider this on a case-by-case basis. Generally speaking, I think for this one, I think the expectation is that most public procurements will have an environmental impact. So it will only be in exceptional circumstances where you won't be applying it. And the PPN does give some examples. So for example, where the market for the contract is narrow or distorted or struggling, or value for money is likely to be severely compromised, or in the case of a civil emergency. It's not an exhaustive list. There might be other circumstances as well, but I think what's important is that if you aren't going to be applying this PPN, then you are one of those in-scope organisations that I mentioned, that you have an audit trail that justifies the reason not to include it. There is the ability to exclude a bidder if they don't make satisfactory commitments. And again, like I said, there is a scoring methodology set out in the PPN to apply. So well worth having a look at. Secondly, I wanted to talk about PPN 821, and this is about taking account of the bidder's approach to payment. Again, it applies to the procurement of major government contracts, so where the annual value is at least 5 million, and applies to those same in-scope organisations that I mentioned, but certainly we're seeing lots of our other sub-central authority clients applying the provisions of this PPN too. What the question, again, it's got sort of questions in it and a scoring methodology. The questions assess whether a bidder has paid its suppliers in accordance with terms, and whether payment has been prompt. And the definition of prompt is payment of 95% of invoices within 60 days. These questions aren't new. These have been sort of included in a different form for a number of years now, but PPN 821 sort of increases their stringency. As I mentioned before, again, there's an obligation to consider whether it's relevant and proportionate to ask those questions, and the same examples are given in the PPN. The Cabinet Office should also be alerted in advance if you do need an exemption from the from applying this PPN. Finally, I wanted to talk about social value. No procurement webinar is complete without a mention of social value. So this is PPN 620, and we have a separate webinar talking about it in more detail, but just wanted to flag that this is designed to apply at the tender stage and not at the selection stage. So if you are wanting to evaluate social value, you've got the discretionary grounds within the standard selection questionnaire, and you've also got this the net zero PPN, but the bulk of the social value questions are designed to apply at the next stage of the procurement. I think that's all from me. Back to Jenny.
Thanks, Shailee. So yes, I think it's 10:30 exactly, which is really good timing. So that sort of finishes us up for today. So just to say, yeah, please do look out for a follow-up email, which will include the recording and the Q&A document and a copy of the slides. And also to ask you if you can hopefully fill out the feedback form, which should pop up when the webinar ends. But other than that, thank you from me, from Shailee, and from Rona. Thanks very much for attending, and we hope to see you at our next webinar very soon. Thank you.